Hi everyone, welcome to the Office 365 Dev Pulse Show. My name is Scot Hillier and I'm your host. And this week we're coming to you from IT Dev Connections live here in Las Vegas, where we have lots of great SharePoint and Office 365 speakers presenting great content. And one of those speakers is my guest this week, Ted Pattison. He's agreed to share some of the content that he'll be using at IT Dev Connections with us and sort of give us a preview and maybe a little bit of a dry run for him before his session, which is coming up later this afternoon. And unlike most of these shows where we happen to be in different time zones, I'm actually sitting right next to Ted, which means really at any time I could reach over here and give him bunny ears, right? So right next to him, making this our, sort of our live and in-person, intimate type of session here, sort of the unplugged version of the show. So Ted's a long-term person in the SharePoint community. Everybody really knows Ted. He's been around for a long time as a trainer, as an author, and very well known for his ability to synthesize technology and give that to other folks. So Ted, tell us a little something about yourself and maybe some things we don't know yet.
Well, I'm a Gemini. I'm not going to tell you my age, but I have been in the education business for quite a while, going all the way back to the days of COM, then .NET, then SharePoint, then whatever we have now, the post-SharePoint stuff, the Office 365. I was a SharePoint MVP, still am, for about 11 years, and I'm switching over to your side. I'll be an Office 365 Dev MVP in the renewal cycle.
Yes, my joke is you get migrated to the cloud. Right, you go from on-premises SharePoint to Office 365.
Well, that's good. And also, I have a training company, Critical Path Training. Because you train for me. We have some good trainers, him, Andrew Connell, Matt McDermott, just to name a couple. Next week, I'm delivering my very first Office 365 Dev class, no VM with a local SharePoint installation, but live against Office 365. And also writing this talk for doing authentication code was a really good exercise for me to, get beyond being able to use it, but being able to explain it, or hopefully being able to explain it.
We're going to find out.
Yeah. So what I thought we'd do in this hour is to go through, what I think is a good agenda for people who are now getting into Office 365 development. A lot of people might be coming from SharePoint on-premise development backgrounds, or maybe you're just an ASP.NET developer, maybe you're new to Visual Studio and the Microsoft stack. But what we're going to see is that OAuth and OpenID Connect give us the foundation for all of our authorization and authentication. So we have to kind of talk through and just start a little bit in theory of what is OAuth and what is OpenID Connect, and then to put some meat to the bones by talking about how we do it in the Office 365 arena, which is using Azure Active Directory. And then we're going to see things that developers care about, coding components. So we have the Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL, for .NET. We'll introduce that. We'll have to write a little conceptual code, not the real-world code, but just kind of seeing how the pieces work. Then also OWIN middleware components are very important in the new space, so we're going to look at those, and I'm going to kind of bring them in incrementally to build people's understanding slowly. And then at the very end, we want to take a look at what we do for single-page applications that are all client-side JavaScript. We use something called the Active Directory Authentication Library for JavaScript.
Okay. That is a pretty full agenda.
I think we can get through this in an hour now.
We might be rushing a little bit.
Okay, so I'll talk very fast.
There we go.
But a lot of us, are used to doing security in a Active Directory domain on premises, and you're in an area where everybody trusts everybody else as far as the servers go, and things that worked in this old school enterprise security, just aren't going to work in the new internet security model. So one thing that's different is we don't just have PCs now. We have those gosh darn Mac computers that we have to worry about, but more importantly, there's the mobile phones, there's the other types of devices that people are using. Does your application that you're writing, which we're going to start using the term client. Client means the application you are writing. Does the client run on a web server? Does the client run on a Windows phone? Does it run on an iPhone? And then we have these things that we want to talk to. Now, the OAuth specification calls them resource servers. My one correction to the OAuth spec is I think we should call them resource services because we don't want to imply a particular box there. But the idea is now we have to get out and talk to these things. So we have this idea of OAuth where we have an authorization server. And the idea is that you have an end user who's using a user agent, a browser, and it needs to talk to your application, your client, and your client needs to be able to talk to the resource services on your behalf. So there's these different authentication flows that we're going to talk about. But at the end of the day, all the authentication flows really have the sole purpose of getting an access token from the authorization server to the client. And the client can then call to the resource services with the access token, which basically provides the credentials.
So it's all about allowing that application to do something on behalf of the person who's using it.
Exactly right. And we basically have to forget everything we've known about Windows integrated security and how security works within an Active Directory domain where Windows is in charge of everything. Now we have to do something that's based on open standards. So one thing about OAuth is it requires you to register your application or register your client. So when we register the client, we're going to basically go to the authorization server. Once again, this could be Twitter, could be Google, could be Facebook, could be Azure Active Directory.
Might be.
And the client ID will be GWIDS if you use a Microsoft-based one, and might be something entirely different if you use something else. Now, when you register the client, you get a client ID, but there's also going to be various attributes we track about the application. Certain types of applications have secrets so that they can use those as passwords or client certificates to be able to authenticate with the server. And then another really big part of this is something called a reply URL, what's also called a redirection URI. So basically this is a fixed endpoint that the client's organization owns. And the idea is if we know that the authorization server can push something to our reply URL, it has the benefit of knowing that it's pushing to a URL that we own, and it's basically used to transmit security tokens to the client. Now, another thing that we have inside here, we now have some people inside this room.
That's right, we're live, so there may be attendees walking in and out every now and then.
Now, let's talk a little bit about access tokens. You've heard about access tokens, but let me kind of put them, an access token, think of it as a single standardized credential format. Now, the user might have lots of different ways, whether it's username, password, certificates, sometimes you have two-factor authentication, but the idea is if after we have the user authenticate, if we can always reduce it to this access token, this standardized format, well then resource services only have to know about one type of credential. Now the idea is the access token gives access to the resources. The access token contains a scope, and that scope contains permissions. And a couple other things. The access token, if you look at the OAuth spec, should be considered opaque to the client, which means the client should not look into it and take knowledge. Now, what we're going to see is you can look in the access token and get all kinds of information, but the spec says do not take advantage of that inside your code. The last point is the access token is a bearer token. A lot of people say it's like cash. If you lose a $20 bill, it's a lot worse than using your ATM card. So when we pass these bearer tokens around, we always want to use SSL in the transmission. Now, there's going to be quite a few authentication flows. Just to quickly breeze through them, there's user credentials flow, where we pass to the authorization server the username and password, and it can give us back an access token. The one that we really like is the authorization code grant flow. And the idea is the client first obtains an authorization code and then uses it to get an access token. We're going to see that has a lot of benefits. There's a client credentials flow. If you've done SharePoint app development and you know about app-only permissions, client credentials flow is pretty much the same thing. It's when the client authenticates with the authorization server, but not with user identity, with the application identity. And at the very end, we're going to look at something called the implicit grant flow, which is used for single-page applications. Now, OAuth 2.0 was really designed for authorization. So it creates access tokens, it gets them to the client, and the client can then call to the resource service, passing the access token, and basically get the authorization it needs. Okay, the problem we have is the access token, as it was designed, was never intended to really authenticate the user. So access tokens do not carry any type of user identity data. On top of that, OAuth 2.0 doesn't require validation of access tokens. to really be sure that this access token, came from this issuer and was issued to this particular client. So we had this problem where when OAuth 2.0 came out, lots of different websites, Facebook is the one that comes to mind, had shortcomings in their implementation and were subject to different types of attacks like cross-site request forgery attacks. There's a great post. The guy that invented or designed OAuth 1.0 basically got so unhappy with what was going on with OAuth 2.0 that he asked to have his name taken off, and he has a great post, OAuth 2.0, The Road to Hell. Now, what we really need to do is basically just tighten up OAuth. You can really say that OAuth was intended to be a protocol or a specification, but lots of different vendors got involved and started saying, well, I have this phone, and it's not a regular thing. We need to kind of lower the barriers for security. And so the OAuth specification became a framework that says may and should a lot more than it does must. So when you look at OpenID Connect, it's really a protocol or specification to take what should have been a specification, OAuth 2, that became a framework, and move it back to a specification. So the idea is that OpenID Connect gives us the extra pieces. It's OAuth plus more. So the idea is now, instead of an authorization server, we're going to call it an OpenID provider. It's going to do all the same things that OAuth does, but it's going to now give us this extra type of token, which is called an ID token. The ID token is going to allow the client to authenticate and basically make sure that the ID token was provided by someone it trusts, and so on. Okay, so now what we need to do is move into Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is Microsoft's Active Directory in the cloud. So it plays the role of an OpenID Connect provider. So it creates access tokens based on OAuth 2.0, and it creates ID tokens based on OpenID Connect. Anytime you see someone implement an OpenID Connect, they're implementing OAuth plus more stuff so that we can really authenticate the user with these ID tokens that we're going to see. Now, Active Directory, or Azure Active Directory, is important because it is the OpenID Connect provider that we need to use when we want to talk to Office 365, or Exchange Online, or SharePoint Online, or Power BI with its REST API. And I can even create my own custom web services and install them and configure them as clients inside of Azure Active Directory, and then I can have different types of applications authenticating against my custom web service. Okay, now, when we're using Office 365, and we have an Office 365 environment, we have something which is based on a tenancy. A tenancy is a scope for managing users. It's also a scope for creating site collections in SharePoint Online. And behind Office 365 and its tenancy, Azure Active Directory creates a directory. So the idea of a directory and a tenancy, is really the same thing. It's basically, we're going to see a tenancy ID, but that is going to identify the tenancy in which your users are basically managed and in which your applications get registered. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do in my next demo is get up with the Azure Management Portal, start doing a little bit of stuff inside there. And one of the things that you're going to need to do is discover your tenancy ID. Now, let me move over here. Now, here's an example. I've just opened the Azure Management Portal. I've gone to my directory inside here. You can see we have users inside. One thing to note, the user I'm going to be demoing is this CPT student, and that users have an object ID. Basically, it's just a GUID that identifies a particular user. Also, we're going to have applications inside here. And there's applications that my company can use that are written by Microsoft or other companies. And then there's also applications that my company owns, and they're the ones that I've created and are registered in my particular tenancy right here. Now, let's say that we want to figure out, what our tenancy ID is. Well, the way that you can do that is by clicking View Endpoints. If I click on View Endpoints, notice that you can see that there is this GUID that's consistent in all these. So basically, that is going to be the GUID of your tenancy, which you might need. Now, as we keep going through, let's point out that at a high level, there are 4 primary types of applications or clients that you might register with Azure Active Directory? Well, there's going to be the native client. There's going to be the web application client that has server-side code. And then there's the web application client that has no server-side code but runs as a single-page application. And then there's going to be the web service client. Now, when you think about clients, clients that have server-side code, so the web application client and the web service client, are known as confidential because they can keep secrets like passwords or private keys associated with a public key. When you have something like an SPA, a single-page application where everything gets loaded to the browser, we refer to that as a public client. And it can't have any secrets, and it's not going to be able to do things in as secure a fashion as a confidential client. Okay, now, there's lots of different application properties. You know, for instance, if I go back here and I say, let's create a new application, create an application my organization is developing, and I'll just call this my web client. Do I want this to be a web application or a web API? I'll say yes inside here. What is the sign-on URL? And generally, as you're doing development, you know, you might have some type of a local host address that you might be using inside here. So let's go ahead and put the sign-on URL. You have this app ID URI. It's a little bit silly. It's just a unique string, but you have to put it in the form of a URL. And so if I had something like cpt labs.onmicrosoft.com as my particular domain, since this is my domain, I'm the one who's allowed to create things inside here, and I can just call this, you know, app12345, just something that is unique inside there. Okay, now once you've created this particular application, you know, what you're going to see is that there's lots of different things that you can configure inside here. Whether it's multi-tenant, you can configure, well, you're able to copy the client ID. It creates the client ID, passes that back to you. Also, you're able to put the reply URLs inside here. Now, in my first sample, what I'd like to do is I'd like to show an example where we have a reply URL controller. Now, in most cases, the reply URL is just going to be the base of the actual address itself. But now we're going to go ahead and change this right here just for this first particular demo. Okay, now a couple other things to point out. Is the application multi-tenant? Do you have application permissions? So if I go back here, you know, one of the things that you can see is that if you have a single tenant application, you register it in a tenancy, and it can only be used by users in that tenancy. So it's your typical corporate development project where you're creating something for one organization. You can also have a multi-tenant application. And the idea is I could create a client application. I can configure it for multi-tenant. I register it with my tenancy, but then it can be used by users from other tenancies inside there. So that gives you the, you know, the approach for creating a software as a service style of application. Now, we also have permissions. Permissions get to be really important here. If I go down here, notice that there are application permissions and delegated permissions. Delegated permissions means that an access token has user identity, and your client can only do it if the user also has those permissions inside there. Works very much like the SharePoint SharePoint add-in model. We also have this notion of application permissions, or what we in the SharePoint world kind of consider app-only permissions. And the idea is that it doesn't matter what permissions the user has, or in that case, it doesn't even matter if there isn't a current user. The application could just basically reach in if it has application permissions inside here. Okay, now, there's also app manifests. In many cases, you don't have to deal with the app manifest when you're getting started. But note that if I have my application that I'm working on, and as I am working with that, let me go ahead and save my changes right there. You have this ability to upload and download a particular manifest. For instance, let's say I go to this web client right here, and then we say manage manifest, download manifest, and it will allow you to download the manifest that looks like it does on the slide. Now, the reasons you might need to download the manifest is that the UI of the Azure portal doesn't give you the control that you need. So you might have to download the manifest, update it to allow something like implicit flow, or to add the data for a X509 certificate, if that's what you're using to authenticate, then you upload it. Also, by creating something in a dev environment and then being able to upload the manifest to create a new app in production, would be another reason that you need to get in touch with the manifest. Okay, one more slide, then we'll go ahead and do a little bit of demo work. There are authorization endpoints and token endpoints. And there are different authentication flows. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a very bare bones demo that's going to show you how you can kind of code this up by hand. Now, by the time we get to the end, I'm going to add a bunch of Microsoft software that's going to make this unimportant. Here's some endpoints right here. Now, there are these two different endpoints. There's the authorization endpoint and the token endpoint. The authorization endpoint is the one we really, redirect the client to begin with. So the authorization server, Azure Active Directory, might need to prompt them for a username, password. It might need to prompt them to consent to the permissions that my application requires. So let's look at a simple example. So we have this example right here, and note that I have a client that has already been registered with a client ID. There's also a client secret. Now, if I go back here and we take a look at this particular application right here, let's go ahead and open this up. And what you'll see is that we have, under the configure page, the ability to have a client secret, which is a key. And the idea is that it can add one for you that's good for a specific period, 1 or 2 years. And the idea is that you can take this. Notice that you don't have the key value until you save for the first time. Also note that you're able to have more than one key, and you just need any one of them inside there. But what we're going to see here, is after this has been saved, as it has been just now, I should be able to go back there and now get the key, copy the key, and then paste it somewhere into my code. So we have a client secret or a key value, and that's used as a password. Here's just some of the details. I won't worry too much about this because other software we're going to use is going to cover up all this. But you need a target resource. That's the service that you want to use that you're trying to get permissions for. There's going to be a sign-on URL and the reply to URL. Now also note that when we put together the authorization URL, it's going to have query string parameters that tells us things about resource, client ID, and also we'd like to get what's called an authorization code. Now let's go ahead and run this right here. And what you're going to see here is that I just put a simple link in place. Now if I go back here and I take a look at that particular link, I'm basically just saying let's go to the authorization URL, which I've put right inside here. And the idea is that when we go to the authorization URL, we redirect the user to a page where Microsoft has support to authenticate the user. So now they're at a page that Microsoft has created. The user puts in their credentials, chooses OK, and if the user already had all the permissions that he or she or had already consented or someone else consented permissions, it might go right back to the application. Sometimes it goes back and prompts the user to consent to properties inside there. Now, the idea is when it comes back here to the reply URL, what we're going to do is we're going to take the code that comes out inside there. Just to give you a better sense of this, let me go ahead and bring up Fiddler. With Fiddler running, let's go ahead and try that one more time. So what we're going to do here is we're going to click to authenticate, and when we get to this page right here, and we go look at Fiddler, some of the things that we can see is that we push them to the authorization endpoint. And if I look under web forms right here, I'm passing them the resource that I want, the client ID that represents me, the client app, the redirect URI it's going to push back to, and that I want an authorization code. Now, when I do that, eventually it's going to post back to me. So let's go ahead and actually fill this out at word 1. We're going to go ahead, choose OK right here. So basically it's going to post back, and as it did that particular post back inside here, we should be able to go down and find that, and there is the authorization code that's being passed back to me. Now, I'm going to take that authorization code, turn around, and now I'm going to pass the authorization code to the authorization server along with the client secret. So here, the user has been authenticated by the authorization server, but we also do something to authenticate the client, so Azure Active Directory, gets more validation. It really is the client that's making this request. We pass the code, and if we look at the JSON that comes back, we can see that there's my access token, there's the ID token, there's something called a refresh token that we can start using. Okay, so that first demo was really just to kind of show you the nuts and bolts of how things work. But now we don't want to have to program down at that level, so let's introduce our first assistant component, which is the Active Directory Authentication Library for .NET. Now, ADAL, as we like to call it, is an authentication library that comes in the .NET flavor and in a JavaScript flavor. When we use the .NET component for ADAL, we can use it in native applications that run on the desktop. We can also use it for web clients that run in the middle tier. And ADAL is there to handle the authentication flow for us behind the scenes. It also provides a very handy service in caching tokens for us, as we'll see. Now, to add this to either a console application or a Windows presentation, a foundation application, or probably an MVC application if you're doing server-side work, you simply have a NuGet package, which is the Microsoft Identity Mile.clients.active directory. Now, currently, the released versions are the 2.0 versions. You don't want to use the 1.0 versions because they didn't handle the web client. They only handled the native client reliably. So 2.0 gave us better handling of the web client and caching. 3.0 is now in pre-release, and I'll make a couple comments about 3 as we keep going through here. Now, let's say that I want to just do something with a native client, just to show you something really simple. So if, first of all, we go back and we take a look at the different applications, well, I have a native client. Now, native clients, as we'll see, if you use a very straightforward implementation, they have a redirect URI, but the redirect URI isn't really an endpoint on the internet. It's basically something that goes back inside here. Okay, this console seems to be taking a while to come back. Okay, so we have a client ID, we have a redirect URI, but there's no client secret inside here. Now, when I look at this native client, what I wanted to do is kind of keep things very simple as far as what I'm doing so we can really focus on the authentication flow aspect of this. Let's go ahead and open this project for the native client right here. And so in my native client, I need the authority that I'm going to log in with. Notice that I'm using the common authority. I could use the one that has the GUID of the tenant. Sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you can use common. Okay, now here we create what's called an authentication context that points to an authority, and then the authentication context has things like acquire access token. Now let's go ahead and run this right here. And so what you're going to see is that when I run this, this is just a standard console application. The Active Directory Authentication Library basically uses an external browser. It has a hardened version of the Internet Explorer that comes up, but the idea is now the user can come through here, put the password in, and if I go back and we want to take a quick look at how things are going to work on this side, let's go ahead and do a remove all. And now for my console application, we'll go ahead and move forward. So basically, it got an access token back. And the way that it does that is it goes to the login right here. And you can see that it passes the login and password. Now, passing the login and password across the network obviously has some issues. The native client is nowhere near secure as the web client will look at. But that's one way that we get an access token back. Once the access token comes back, what's kind of nice about ADAL is it will automatically cache those access tokens for us over on the other side. Okay, now let's move into probably what most of us will be building, which is going to be web applications that use the authentication code flow. First demo I showed you was just kind of bare bones, basically send the end user and the user agent to this URL, and it goes through the flow. So now, when we look at the authentication code flow, of all the flows, it's the one we like because user credentials are passed right from the Microsoft page at the authorization server to another Microsoft page. So user credentials are never seen by the client server-side application code. What's going to happen is the user redirects to the authorization server. The authorization server redirects to a page where the user types in the user password, back to another Microsoft-controlled page that then authenticates and passes back an access token. Now, once your server-side code has the access token, it can call right to the token endpoint and get the token back. And so not only is it beneficial that the user credentials never get seen by the client, another big benefit is the access token never passes through the browser or the user agent, which would be, something that would open things up for attack. Also, once we get back an access token, we get back something else which is called a refresh token. So once you've got an access token and you have a refresh token along with it, access tokens have a lifetime which lasts about an hour. Refresh tokens last 14 days. So once you get an access token and a refresh token, you use the access token for an hour, and then you use the refresh token to refresh it. Now, this isn't something that all OAuth2 authorization servers do, but Azure Active Directory supports a really neat thing which is known as a multi-resource refresh token. And the idea is, let's say that I don't just want to use the Azure Graph API, I also want to go to SharePoint Online. Once you get that first access token back, you can use the associated refresh token to get an access token for another resource, which does a great job in cutting down the need to interact with the user and make them put in the username and password. Okay, now let's look at a second demo. Now, this demo is going to use the Active Directory authentication library. Excuse me. So, a couple things that we're going to do here. One is that I have a little class called Custom Authentication Manager, because we're not using OWIN yet. OWIN is going to do some neat things. It's basically going to tie the authorization server's result to the ASP.NET security model. We don't have that yet, so we're going to create a custom authentication manager. Now, we also are going to have a reply URL inside here. Now, let's go ahead and run this right here. Now, as I run this right here, what we're going to do is we're going to start by clicking on the sign-in link. And when I click on the sign-in link, we're going to add an account controller. Is just going to navigate me to account/sign-in, where now I'm going to redirect to the URL authorization endpoint. So the behavior we're going to have is once we've done that and we go ahead and the user puts in the password, it comes back to our reply URL. Now, another thing here that I wanted to show is in demo constants, note that under prompt, you can say you don't want a prompt. You can say you always want the user to log in, regardless of whether the flow might have implicitly authenticated the user. But you can also say consent, which basically means it's always going to make the user accept the permissions, the delegated permissions that the app is requesting. We'll go ahead, we'll choose OK right here. And now what's going to happen is you're going to hit the authorization or the reply URL. Now, in this reply URL, what I now want to show is that when we use the ADAL for .NET, we can create an authentication context, and now we can simply call things like acquire access token by authorization code. So once again, it's doing the interaction with the token service on our behalf. Once this comes back, now we have this result that comes back. Now, in our case right here, I have my little custom class, and we're just going to take what comes back, that authentication result, and we're going to take information such as we're going to create a session variable saying the user has authenticated. We're going to cache things like the tenant ID, the user ID, the username, the ID token, the access token. Now, other things that you can do once you know the user is authenticated, for instance, let's go and look at a particular view. Let's look at the shared view. And now I can say things like, if custom authentication manager, if the user has authenticated, show these links, but don't show them other places. For instance, if I sign out, the links go away. Once the user signs in, my custom authentication manager, realizes that there is a new user session. And so it kind of gives me the ability to have parts of the UI light up. Now, once I use the authentication code and I acquire the access token, I get an ID token and an access token. If I look at the ID token right here, some of the things that you can see is that it comes back as a encoded base64 string that you can decode and you can look at. Here I just wanted to show some of the things that we can find inside of the ID token. But things like the first name and last name are things you're going to be able to find out. And then also another way that the ID token differs from the access token is the ID token has information that we can use to validate the ID token, make sure it came from the right issuer, make sure it was created for me, and we can do validation to prevent some of the attacks that have plagued OAuth in the past. If I look at the access token, remember the access token is supposed to be opaque, meaning that you're not supposed to take advantage of what's inside here. If you're just curious, I'm just kind of showing you a dump of some of the claims that have been put inside there. You can see, who is the issuer of this token, what is the audience that this token is to be used for. If you look at these issued at, not before an expiration, these are date times, and it's a little bit silly, but they take the 1st of January 1970, and that's the number of seconds since that particular day. So if you wanted to translate that into actual time. Okay. Now, we also have the ability, once we get an access token, to refresh the access token. Now, here, because I haven't added OWIN yet, we've added a couple more things to kind of simulate, and one of it is get the refresh token. So when the refresh token comes back, I've cached it, and then I can grab the refresh token, and once we've refreshed the token inside here, what we're able to do is to basically, and as I click use the refresh token to get a new access token, you can see that this valid from is getting longer and longer each time. So basically the idea is use the refresh token to get a new access token, but then you can basically replace both the refresh token and access token at the same time inside here. Okay, now, next thing we're going to look at is the client credentials flow. Now, at this point, my application is always authenticating with an access token that has user identity. However, one of the issues there is back here inside of my application, I might not just have delegated permissions. I might have added some of these application permissions because I want real power to be able to, access the directory and query for all particular users without being constrained by the permissions of one particular user. So first, you need application permissions. Second, you need to authenticate with a client credentials flow, which lets you authenticate with app-only credentials. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to create a client-side certificate. Now, I basically found a simple way for myself to do this, and the way that I've done this is that I will have a particular PowerShell script. Let me go ahead and open this up right here. And the idea with it, we're going to use makecab. We're going to call makecab and create a certificate. But then after the certificate gets created, say that I'll create a certificate named Bob inside here. We go ahead and run it, and then this little script also creates some JSON that we're going to need to put inside the app manifest. And the idea is that once you've created the certificate, we have to get a couple things off the certificate. For instance, we need a new GUID, we need to get the certificate hash, or what's called the thumbprint, and then the raw value. And so this little PowerShell script kind of gives me these particular values, And then what we're going to have to do is download the manifest, go to keys, and basically add that inside there, upload it. And then once we've done that, the last piece is back inside of my application. I have a secrets folder. And so when we create these client-side keys, we basically need a password-protected PFX file. And the idea is you take the password-protected PFS file, you put it somewhere, inside of your application directory, or if your security requirements are higher, you might use all kinds of ways to, make this so it's not obtainable to the bad guy. But the idea is that now that you've got that, let's look at the simple piece of code that I have here on the slides, is that the top code shows you how to create a X509 certificate 2 object from that PFX file. You'll need the password to be able to do that. And then what ADAL wants is a client assertion certificate. Once you get that client assertion certificate, if we look at the code down below here, you can see that when you call acquire token and you pass a resource and then just a certificate that identifies the client but not the user, then you get back the app-only token inside here. Okay, so once again, if I come back here, here is a regular access token, and the subject is going to be the user itself. When you have the app-only access token, all of a sudden the subject becomes the app, and the app actually becomes the resource owner because it's the one that has permissions it needs. It doesn't have to get delegated permissions from a different user. Okay, so now that we've seen that, the last part of the Active Directory Authentication Library that's very important is the token caching mechanism. And so ADAL2 was redesigned to make things work in the middle tier. And one of the things we needed was a caching scheme where I could create a custom caching component and plug it in. And so what you'll see is that the token caching that Microsoft is recommending is going to build on top of Entity Framework to build the database. And the idea is that we can now create a class per web user cache and then create a database on that. And then ADAL is going to be able to utilize my cache and simply add and remove things from inside there. Now, last piece is something which is called OWIN, the Open Web Interface for .NET. Now, understanding this is going to be really important for doing OAuth2 authentication in middle tier or web applications. OWIN is a framework that has been built to get rid of the big monolithic ASP.NET Core DLL. The problem with that is that you have so many components built into one DLL, you can't revise any of the pieces independently. So OWIN serves to decouple the web server from the application code that you write, and the idea is encourages the development of simple modules for .NET web development and allows much faster evolution of specific web modules, which is really good for something like OAuth and OpenID Connect that's moving so quickly. Now, there's something called Katana, which is Microsoft's OWIN implementation. Now, to use this, you simply add a whole bunch of NuGet packages. There's the core OWIN package. There's OWIN security that adds security inside there. There's OWIN security cookies that basically gives us something like forms-based authentication. It basically allows us to authenticate and then to tie that authentication into the ASP.NET security system. And then there's the OpenID Connect security module inside there. Now, generally, you're also going to use the Entity Framework and Active Directory library inside there. Now, let me come back to the slide in just a second. Let's go back, and we're going to look at just one more demo. I think that's looks like all we're going to have time for here. But what we're going to have right here is a SharePoint Online web client. And let's go ahead and start this up. And so when you have OWIN, one thing about OWIN is it serves to replace the older style where we initialize our application with a global.asax file. Instead, we're going to have a startup class. And the idea is that you have a startup class and you have a configuration method inside there, and then there's something that tells the OWIN framework to call this. Now, if I look at the typical Microsoft formatting of a project, they're going to put most of the OWIN initialization code in startup.auth.cs. So here we have a startup class, and the idea is that they will call configure OAuth and pass you this iAppBuilder object. Now, when that gets called, first thing we do is set default sign-in as authentication type, and this is basically saying let's use the new style of JSON Web Tokens and OAuth, not the older, more complex FedAuth or WS-Fed. Next, let's use cookie authentication. So basically that says let's create a cookie when the user has been authenticated, push it back and forth with a browser session. And then finally, let's use OpenID Connect authentication. So now I'm configuring the OAuth middleware component to do the work. I give it the client ID for my client app. I give it the authority I want to log in. And then I can do things like register callbacks. I want to register a callback notification. So when it handles the callback to the reply URL, it then simply calls to my code so that I can do something like take the authentication code and then go ahead and acquire an access token inside there. Okay, so here we'll go ahead, we'll sign in. Once we have signed in, it's going to go back through that particular flow. And so now I have my first access token for a particular resource. Now, if I look back at the slides, automatically redirects users to the authorization endpoint. So now you don't need to have your own controller, which is the reply URL. It does that for you automatically. So it handles the callback from the authorization server and automatically calls that notification event for you. It also establishes user identity in ASP.NET, meaning that now I can look at claims principles inside here. So the idea here is that we have different user claims that we would like to look at. For instance, if I go down here to my token manager class and we look at one of these, we can now create a claim security principle, and we can basically look for different types of claims that are inside there. So once the user is authenticated, all these type of things are available to your code. How do I say welcome CPT student? Well, OWIN's helping with that. So if I go back here and we look under shared and we look now under this partial login, you can see down here that I take a claims principal, I get the current one, and I find the first name and the last name and take the username and basically build that right inside there. Okay. What else is nice? Makes user claims available to your code. Also, it lets you use the authorized attribute. This one's really big because if you have some type of a controller, and let's say it's the SharePoint site controller, and if the user is not yet authenticated with ASP.NET, if you put authorize and a user tries to go to this controller, well, it's automatically going to redirect the user to sign in, and now OWIN helps you basically get that first redirect to do the authentication inside there. You know, so once again, there's a lot of different pieces. Okay, now one more thing we need to look at when we're looking at this, and that is refresh tokens. So what you'll find is really easy is to get up and going with a single resource token. But what you're generally going to need is tokens for more than one resource. So in this case, I get one token. Let's look at the token cache right here. The token cache now has one token, and the resource is graph.windows.net, and you can see the tenant ID, client ID, the unique ID of the user. But is it a multi-resource refresh token? That's true. So now, let's say that I want to get a token for something like a team site that has a different URL. It's a different resource. I need a separate access token for it. Now, let's go ahead and look at two pieces of code. First piece of code that I'm going to show you is the call to get access token, but only in theory. The idea is once we create an authentication context, well, now I can say authentication context.token class, read the items that are inside. So if I read an item and it is a multiple refresh token, I can grab that refresh token. If I don't find a multi-resource refresh token, well, that's going to be a problem, so I'm just going to stop. But if that's not the case, we can acquire a token with the refresh token inside here. Okay, now, the reason that I wanted to show you this code, but then tell you theory only, is that Microsoft doesn't want you actually touching the refresh tokens. In fact, when we go to ADAL 3.0, they've removed the access token so you can't get your grubby little fingers on it. And the reason for that is that they'll do that same work for you. So here's get access token. So now, get access token, pass me the resource, which might be a different resource. And so what we're going to do here is we're simply going to acquire token silent async. There's the resource. You have to give it a client credential, which is going to use, and then the user identifier. But the idea here is now I can go to a second resource, and behind the scenes, they automatically go to the token cache, they find the refresh token for resource 1, and they use that refresh token to get the access token for resource number 2. And after they do that, you can get the refresh token for number 3 and number 4 inside there. Okay. Now, the last thing, which I think I probably have 10 seconds to talk through, is ADAL for JavaScript. So there is another model once you start writing single-page applications that have no server-side code. And there's something called ADAL for JavaScript, but I think for time limitations, I think I should just kind of stop there and hand control back over to you.
We'll do that as the proof is left to the user, or maybe some homework. How about that? Well, I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted. That was a huge amount.
I did all the talking.
It's a huge amount of information, but really great. And the nice thing is that we record all of these, so if folks need to go back and review some of the things that you've been talking about, they'll be able to do that up on IT Unity. But this is super valuable information because I know you probably would agree with me that one of the biggest challenges developers have in moving to this new world is just really understanding the security plumbing and how it all works and getting that to go. You know, it's the business rules are not the challenge; it's the logging in and all that that becomes the challenge.
And the different components, ADAL and OWIN, and when you create new projects, they throw everything in there and kind of seeing how the different pieces build an extra functionality. I think it's important to kind of get that understanding. Yeah, so it's great. I want to thank you for spending an hour with us explaining that. We'll apologize again for the kind of room shift that we had to do in the middle, but I think we managed to pull it off with only just a short break. So I wanted, before we go, I want to make sure that I thank our sponsor, Microsoft, for their support. Without Microsoft, we wouldn't be doing this show. They're a great partner for us. Again, we're going to thank Ted for spending this time with us, and thank everybody for spending an hour with us as well, learning about OAuth. And we'll see you in 2 weeks on the next show. Thanks.